My mother had 8 girls in a row. And then she figured out what she was doing, and she turned the dial, and she had 3 boys. And I'm the 10th out of 11 kids. And we grew up in a very small farm on the Central Plains in Canada. Didn't have many luxuries of any kind. We didn't have running water. We didn't have a telephone. We didn't have a television. And for the most part, my mother was responsible. She raised 11 kids by herself, because my father was a bit of an alcoholic in the early years and wasn't around a lot. And when you grow up that way, you grow up as a realist. If you can't see it or touch it or feel it, don't buy it, right? And so we became pretty much practical people. I'm talking about my brother and I, for instance. And we weren't about to be swayed by, any kind of gobbledygook. We were forced to be altar boys in our Catholic church until we were 14 or 15 years old. And I want to tell you just briefly, and some of you have heard this, heard me speak yesterday, but you want to know what it's like to drown? It's cool. You're not convinced. It is really. It's a wonderful experience. And I'll just sort of bounce back to that briefly. I'm going to bounce around a little bit. When I was 12 years old, we lived, as I say, on the Central Plains of Canada, and there were a lot of ponds and creeks and what we call dugouts. The Department of Highways when they needed dirt for a road, they would dig big holes, and these things would fill up in the springtime with water. And we had a lot of them around. And my brother and I couldn't swim, and our parents had always warned us not to go near these ponds. And one Saturday, my 2 cousins from the city, who could swim like fish, we ended up about 1.5 miles or 2 miles from our farm home chasing gophers or something like that. And we came upon a pond that the neighbors' kids had left an abandoned raft on. And before you know it, we're bobbing around on this raft in the middle of this 15-foot pond, 15-foot deep. And when my older cousin discovered that not only could we not swim, we were terrified of water, he thought it'd be great fun to rock the raft. And of course, I fell in immediately. Excuse me. It was this... Oh, that? No? Okay. Good, thank you. Actually, I thought I didn't. Thank you.
Do you need a mint or?
No, I'm talking about falling into the water. I spent 5 hours yesterday speaking, and the previous week, training a workshop at the Monroe Institute. So my voice is like ready to fall right out. But so I fell into this water, into this dam, right? And it was the strangest thing, because I didn't have the presence of mind to even dog paddle. I couldn't swim. I knew I couldn't swim, and so I was just toast. And immediately I began to sink to the bottom. And I could feel my feet sink into the mud at the bottom. It's about 15 feet deep. And I must have kicked or something, because I began to float up again, and I could feel the water getting warmer and brighter, and I reached the surface, and my head may have actually come through the surface of the water. And again, I sunk back down into the water. And everything became darker as it was going down. Then an interesting thing happened. I always thought that drowning would be a horrible way to die. I mean, even at 12 years old. And we've all had that experience, right? Gasping for breath, and you suck in a big gulp of water, and how awful that is. Whether you're in the ocean or whether you're in a pool somewhere. And that horrible, terrifying dilemma, right? But it wasn't that way at all. Let me tell you something, it's so cool. When the air goes out, when all the air goes out, and it's replaced by water, when the water comes in and fills your lungs don't struggle. They're full. There is no fighting for air. And just this wonderful peacefulness came over me. And it makes total sense, because that's how we came into the world. We spent the first 9 months of our lives in a liquid environment. And there is no struggle at all. And just sort of like, almost like this peacefulness of being in the womb again. And I wasn't cold, I wasn't hot, I wasn't in any kind of stress at all. And actually that concerned me. I thought I should be worried about this as I sunk into the mud at the bottom of this pond. And the only thing that happened is I wanted to go to sleep. And it would be like lack of oxygen to the brain, right? Eventually, things started to shut down. And I just drifted into this really peaceful sleep. And I'm not sure how long I was gone. I was 6 or 7 minutes, I thought, in the water. But at some point, I woke up with a snap. And it was like one of those where and I knew I was still in the water, but everything had changed. There seemed to be like a bubble of energy around me. And inside this bubble was every color in the rainbow. And it was so remarkable because the colors vibrated. And I could feel the difference. And it was so amazing, and I'll never, ever, ever forget that. On my knees in the mud, on the bottom of this pond, looking at these colors and feeling them, and orange felt different than blue, and blue felt different than purple, and they just vibrated right through me. And I was running my hands through these colors and thinking, this is so cool. I didn't know you could feel colors. And the colors would go right through my body. And I could feel the different vibrations in my body. And I began to think, hey, this is weird. I began to think, I wonder if maybe I'm dying. Or maybe I'm already dead. At 12 years old, I had no concept about death or dying. I didn't even know anybody who had died. The only reference I had to dying was I had, just about 2 weeks before that, I had finished or read the book Tom Sawyer. And remember in the book when Tom is believed to have drowned in the Mississippi and he returns home for his own memorial service, sort of thing. And I thought about that, him ending up at the back of the church, right? And instantly, I went shooting out of the water, just boom. And in a moment later, I am floating above the pews in the choir loft in the back of our Catholic church out in the country, looking down over the whole church, about 3 feet above the pews. And I'm thinking, oh my God, Tom Sawyer didn't fly. I was flying. I was floating, and it was such an amazing, amazing thing. And I found that just with my thoughts, I could control where I floated. And I'm looking down over this church in amazement. I'm thinking, hey, wait a minute. If this is my funeral, where's everybody? Nobody there. It's 4:30 Saturday afternoon. I thought at least my mom and dad would be here, my brothers and sisters, and there was nobody there. But I was caught up in the marvelous, incredible sensations of not being attached to anything, and I could literally float. And it felt like I had my full body, like I was there. In amazement, floating back and forth. A couple of times I floated over the edge, 16 feet down onto the main floor of the church, and it was kind of scary. While I was floating there, at some point, there was suddenly a spasm in the center of my stomach. And in an instant, I'm back on the shore of this pond. And my cousin's got me around the waist, and my face is bouncing in the mud, and he's pumping the water out of me. And I was so amazed. I probably vomited for a minute or two to get all the water out. But afterwards, my lungs burnt a little bit, or it felt strange, but I felt pretty good. But we were all in shock. My little brother's eyes were like this big, and everybody was like freaking out. And so we sat there for a few minutes beside this pond, and we made a pact that we'd never tell another human being, because we'd get whipped, seriously. And so then we walked really slow on the way home so that our clothes would dry. And on the way home, I'm telling my cousin, who is the same age as me, he's 12 years old, but he could swim, I'm telling him about the experience I had, about flying to this church, and about Tom Sawyer, and about this incredible colors in the water, and it's like he didn't hear anything. He's like, Tom Sawyer? He said, we thought you were dead. And they was all like freaking out. So we get home, and we're not home for 10 minutes, and I'm out in the yard, because I'm trying to avoid the adults, right? I'm out in the yard, and then I hear this kayang and cussing in German coming out of my house. And 2 kids got a good whipping on that day, and I was one of them. That'll teach me to die. Right? Strange things that we do. I learned in a hurry that it wasn't something that I could share with people, even my sisters. And I told them about it, and it'd be sort of like, because they were all Catholic, and had certain kinds of concepts about what happens, in the real world. And they'd be like, hey, Mom, you want to check out the kid? Got some water in the brain or something here, right? I didn't realize until many years later how that event had changed my life. How it had, even though it was I ended up in a church, and there was no religious sort of connotations to it. It was just a strange thing that happened. When you're 12 years old and something like that happens, you go, oh, that was weird, and you go on with life, right? Make another slingshot, get in trouble. And so I went on with life, not realizing how that event had changed me or my reaction to the rest of the world. Without knowing it, I had sort of become more psychic, if you will. And it seemed that I could find things or knew certain things. And I didn't attach any significance to this. It was just sort of, that was me, right? And the rest of my family, my sisters got to know this, that I seemed to have the ability to find things. It was like I could see it in my mind if I focused. And I had 8 sisters, and they lost a lot of things. So they would do that, and they would ask me, and I could find stuff. And of course, that led them to think sometimes that I was the one who took it in the first place. And sometimes that was true. Although I didn't admit it. But it changed how I process information. It changed how I looked at the world. And there were, and we probably all can go back and we can examine times or moments in our life when we're younger and find little examples of wonder or bliss or amazing little coincidences or things that we think are coincidence. Well, I found out in subsequent years, I found out that there really aren't many coincidences. But I want to tell you about a significant event, or a couple of significant events that really changed my whole take on life and why we're here. I played hockey most of my life. So I was like 40 years old and had 2 kids and I'm married. And I played with the Old Timers Hockey League. Old Timers at 40, right? And it was during the beginning of the season, around in November, and we're typical sort of weekend warriors. During the week we're all sitting behind desks and getting fat, eating and drinking coffee and everything else. And on the weekends we're out there, thinking we're kids, right? And we had 2 friends. One was around 40 or 39, and he died of a heart attack playing floor hockey. He was a school teacher. And another friend who was 39, and he had a heart attack. He survived, right? Made it through. But my wife was giving me heck. She was like, you're not 20 anymore, you're 40. You should get in shape. You want to kill yourself, blah, 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 right? And I said, geez, woman, I'm, never been in better shape. Well, just shortly after that, 2 Sundays later, Sunday morning, I'm out with my hockey team, 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, and just giving her on the ice. And it felt like somebody had hit me in the chest with a sledgehammer. It just came on just really quickly. And I could hardly breathe, so I went and sat on the bench, and very soon I began to sweat profusely, and my elbow began hurting. At the tip of my elbow was so incredibly that I couldn't believe it. I thought, I can't remember, I didn't hit anybody or bang it anywhere. It was just, but it became sicker and sicker. And obviously I thought, well, I cannot continue this. So I went back into the dressing room, got dressed, and got out of there, was heading out of there, and looked up this long stairway out of the bottom of the rink. And I thought, I'll never make it up there. And I thought, I should go to the hospital, I guess. I don't know what I got, must be the flu. And a rink attendant happened to be coming by, and he saw me just sort of hanging on the wall, looking up at the sweating beads, And he said, "You okay, Mr. Mayor?" I was the mayor then. And he ran off and he called an ambulance, and I thought, I don't know if I'm okay. And very soon I couldn't hang on to the wall anymore, and pretty soon I'm, sitting, on my bum in the hallway, on top of my hockey duffel bag, and everything started to go, black, and I started drifting out of consciousness. And then I could hear the wheels of the ambulance attendants and the paramedics coming running down, with this stretcher. And they loaded me on it, and they put me in the ambulance, and we're whisking off to the hospital, and the young lady is asking me questions like, my name and address so they know where to send the bill. And while I'm talking to her, it started to sound like I'm in a barrel. And I thought, that is so odd. And I thought, I felt a shift, a movement in my body. And, excuse me. And pretty soon I couldn't see anymore. And everything turned gray, turned black. And I'm turning inside, I'm getting dizzy, and I'm really sweating, and the pain is incredible in my elbow. And then I can't hear anymore. And I just drifted into this silence. And I awoke a moment or two later. I think I became conscious again. Remember when you were in high school, if you played in the band, if you had all the musical talent that I had, you got to play the triangle. Right? So it was like I suddenly became aware of this huge ping right in the center of my consciousness. It was like somebody had taken one of those dumb triangles and went bing, and it just vibrating. And I became aware again. And I started to move. My body started to, it felt like a leaf. And I had an out-of-body experience before this, just once. I started to move like a leaf on the wind. I started to slowly move up to the ceiling of the ambulance. And guess what I thought of? I thought, oh boy, Candace is going to be so ticked. My famous last words, never been in better shape. Mm-hmm. Put that on his tombstone, won't you? And I floated up to the ceiling of the ambulance, and I'm looking down, and I can see the young lady, and I'm not even sure that she was aware of this was happening. And she's checking her wristwatch and adjusting the oxygen mask on my face. And I thought, ooh, this is the big one. I'm dying. And I thought about my wife being ticked. And I thought about my kids, and the next thing I knew, in an instant, I was floating in the living room of my house, watching my wife and kids get ready for church. And I thought, oh, it's Sunday morning. Yeah, I should probably be in church. And I spent a few moments at the ceiling of my bed, or the ceiling of my living room, watching them scurry about, saying goodbye, I guess, because I knew somehow that they, that it would be tough for a while, but they'd be okay. It would be all right. And so I said goodbye in that fashion, and I thought about my body, and in an instant I'm back in the ambulance floating at the ceiling as it's screaming on the way to the hospital. And it was like I'm in the ambulance floating there watching and looking and saying goodbye to my own body. And I knew this was my time, it seemed to be. And then there became, it was like it was drawn, pulled up through the ceiling of the ambulance. And it was such a weird thing because I could feel the inner surface of the roof, like the leather, and then I could feel the insulation and I could feel the metal as I went slowly through it. And came out of the top of the ambulance in total amazement And I floated about 10 or 20 feet above the ambulance, watching it roar off, on the way to the hospital, and watching the traffic go out of the way and stuff like that. And I began to feel this compulsion or pull, and it was as if I was drawn like by a magnet, and I'm flying very fast, getting faster and faster. And I began to see this peak of light, and I wasn't sure if that peak of light was here in the third eye, or if it was real and external to me. But it was getting bigger, and I'm flying faster and faster towards it. And there was nothing that I wanted more than to get to this light. Because I knew what it was. And remember the movie E.T., when E.T. is, sort of sick and decrepit, and he's in this little coffin-like thing, and the spaceship comes back, and his heart lights up, and he's like, home, home, home. And that's how it felt. I was going home, and I couldn't wait for it. About that time, there was suddenly, in the center of my consciousness, there was like an explosion. And it just went boom. And in an instant, I'm in my body again, lying on the emergency table in the hospital, and the doctors had torn open my shirt. They'd cut my pants off. I have no idea why that was necessary. And it was so strange because I'm in my body and I'm aware, but it's like I can't control it. And the pain in my elbow was so terrific. I would have said, cut it off, I'll go without it, because it was so extreme. And I'm thinking, what's that got to do with, So this doctor came up close beside me, and I still had my jacket on. It's in the wintertime. And he reaches behind me and lifts me up, sits me up, and I sat up, and my head went down like this, my chin was pasted to my chest, and I'm looking, and he comes up beside me, really close by my ear, and he says, Paul, you've got to relax, you're having a heart attack. That's the most ridiculous statement I've ever heard. How on earth am I supposed to relax if I'm having a heart attack? Anyway, this went on for a while. They, used a whole bunch of drugs. It took an hour and a half for them to get the blockage out of my heart. And they used some drug called streptokinase or whatever, and they injected it into, Anyway, it was an interesting experience. But for an hour and a half, I got to watch, because I'm hooked up to all the biofeedback stuff, right, to the blood pressure monitor, to the heart rate monitor, and I'm sort of watching this stuff. My heartbeat going, and it would start to fibrillate, and it would change, and it would miss some beats, and the pain was extreme. And sometimes I would sort of drift out of sleep. But watching this feedback, and I thought, this is where it comes down to? Watching this stupid machine count the seconds of my life? And part of me, because I was so excited, I did not want to be back. There were some expletive deletives in my mind when I ended up back on that table, because I didn't want to be there. And part of me, so I would watch this monitor, and my heart would be going boom, 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 and then it would just stop. And then it would go boom, 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 really fast again. And there was part of me, some of the times I was waiting for it to not start up again, and thinking that would be cool. Anyway, at some point, they got the obstruction or the clot in my heart broke free, and it was just like instant relief. My elbow didn't hurt, the pain was gone, and I'm back. So about 3 or 4 days later, this was a strange event. 3 or 4 days later, I'm still in the emergency ward or in the cardiac ward, and I was telling one of the nurses there, who had a very kindly ear, about the experience that I had, about floating up through the top of the ambulance and all of those things. And she thought it was pretty cool. And the heart specialist, my doctor, came through, and she went to the doctor and she says, did Paul tell you what happened? He had this incredible experience, and she was telling him quickly about it. And they're like about 10, 15 feet away from me, right? And it's a small community. So I know all of these people, right? And the doctor was like a stage whisper, and And he's going sort of in a condescending note. He's kind of standing there, talking to her, whispering, and going, well, no, it's a typical response, lack of oxygen to the brain, and wish fulfillment, and I heard this, and I called out, bull, and you know the second word of that. And apparently you're not supposed to say that to your doctor. So he was looking at me, in this sort of, what, like you're an expert or something, And I just said, that's crap. That's not true. And right about that time, a most amazing thing happened. He had, in those days, it was this a number of years ago, he had this beeper in his pocket, and the beeper went off, right? So he pulls it out, and he's looking at it. And this came into my mind, and this had never happened before. And I said, it's Lorraine. Jill's sick, and and her car's in the garage. You have to go pick her up at school. And I couldn't believe that came out of my mouth. And it was just sort of like, where did that come from? And he looked at me like, what? And he leaves. But a half hour, he came back. About a half hour later. He comes back and he says, how could you possibly know that? I said, lack of oxygen to the brain. So, true story. I think it changed his perspective on it, because it was, too close, too real, right? So I'm just trying to sort of capsulize and think of ways, how I can put this in 20 minutes or 15 minutes now. I want to tell you about the most important things. I had a notion about who God was, having been raised as a Catholic. And I can tell you one thing, you can't have an experience, you can't have an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience without replaying it 1,000,000 times in your mind and without examining who you really are, right? I had this profound out-of-body experience shortly after, in which I floated up to the ceiling of my bedroom and ended up floating out the door of my bedroom because it was so incredible. And I had read and heard about out-of-body experiences through a book called Journeys Out of the Body, written by a guy named Robert Monroe in Virginia. And he began or started the Monroe Institute, south of Charlottesville. And it's a most amazing place. But I had heard about that before and I actually read his book. But I didn't believe it. And one night I found myself floating at the ceiling of my bedroom thinking, holy smoke, this guy isn't crazy. It was absolutely real. I floated out the front of my bedroom door and I'm standing in the hallway looking back into my bedroom some 30 feet away, looking at my body and thinking, how is this possible? My brain, my body, the thing I use to think with, is over there, 30 feet away. And yet I'm standing here completely clear and perhaps thinking more clearly than I ever thought before. And there came a voice, and I didn't know if it was inside of me or outside of me, and this voice said, you're not your brain, you're not your body, you're conscious living energy. And I spun around where I was, and there was nobody there. It sounded like a familiar voice, but it wasn't my voice. Our own sort of mental jabbering voice that we have. And I stood there for a moment, and it was like there was a download from the entire universe, from wherever it was. To me, it seemed like it must have taken 2 hours. And I was sort of bathed in this beautiful, blissful feeling. And I began to see everything. I began to see the connections through the entire universe. And it was such a remarkable thing. And I began to understand our notions of God in a much wider way, in a much different way. Suffice it to say that since then I've had hundreds, perhaps thousands of out-of-body experiences. And I wrote about it, and a publisher, Hampton Roads, in the U.S. here in Charlottesville, picked it up, and it's around the world now. But I learned some amazing things about it, about our concepts, that I had to change. I thought I knew who God was. I knew who Jesus Christ was. I mean, we're sort of in Western society. Jesus Christ was the guy who sort of looked like the dude, 30 years old with a beard hanging on my mom's kitchen wall. I knew who God was. I was the stern-faced old guy with a gray beard in the Bible who was going to fry my butt. And I knew he was going to fry my butt because I was Catholic. And see, when you're Catholic, those 10 Commandments, you don't like to really have to actually do them. You just got to think about them. And I did a lot of thinking. So I knew this was going to happen when I was a kid. But this all changed because I had an understanding, and subsequently hundreds of out-of-body experiences and a couple more near-death experiences. And I got to experience something that you will all experience as a life review when we finally leave this world. Right? So how do my notions of God change? I don't believe anymore in an outside God, in a God that's external to us. I am fully convinced that we are all aspects, we are individuated aspects of the Creator. We are the Creator's attempt at continuing experience and evolution, or the Creator's continuing experience in expressions of love. Now that sounds sort of like a New Agey kind of concept, but I've come to understand it as a very real thing. We, as a collective consciousness, we are the Creator. We are God. And for a simile, if you can imagine that if God was the ocean, all of consciousness is the ocean, that's God. We are individual drops of water in the ocean. But each of us contains the DNA and the blueprint for the entire ocean. As a collective group, I think we are the Creator. We designed this. So we're also responsible for it, right? Before we come here, we plan out the kind of lives we're going to live. We really do. You believe in reincarnation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as growing up as a Catholic, it was sort of like, that's that Eastern stuff, right? Couldn't believe that. But I've come to understand and had some powerful experiences in an out-of-body state that were about previous lifetimes and how this all works. And we plan it out. Before we come here, we choose our parents. We travel in circles of family members, for instance. This lifetime you might be the father or the mother, and the next time you might be the daughter or the son, or the lover or the friend. We travel in circles of families. But in addition to that, we all have what they call, or what you might become familiar with as soul groups. We are in groups of souls that are so similar in vibration and harmony to us that we could literally wake up in their bodies and not know the difference. And you no doubt have. Have you had some strange dreams? Repeated dreams sometimes? In a strange place, totally familiar, right? Until you sort of discover that after you wake up, that is totally weird, right? The neat thing about this, about soul groups, and we all are part of them, right? They vary in size from 3 or 4 to hundreds of souls. The neat thing about it, like for instance, my soul group, from what I understand, is fairly small. There are 14 of us. There are 4 of us who are incarnated right now, and 10 who remain on the other side. But the neat thing is that those other 10 get to experience my life and the lives of the other 3 of us that are incarnated. And another neat thing is that when we sleep, we get to experience the lives of the other three, or other members of our soul group that are incarnated. Little bits and little snippets that come into our existence. Have you heard the notion, or some, in some belief systems, that they might say, yes, reincarnation is a real thing, but the lives are all happening at once. We're living all of these lives at the same time, simultaneously. Right? You've heard that? Well, I've heard that too, but that's not the way I read it, but I can understand where that comes from. And I think it's because of this soul group thing. If you can, it's very efficient. Essentially, we can experience many lives at the same time. But there's still a chronological kind of notion to it. Before we come here, we plan out the kind of lives we're going to have. We plan, not the day-to-day things, but we plan out the generalities of our life. We choose our parents, we choose our location. And we enlist the help of spirit guides as well. We all have 2 or 3 of them, if you will. And sometimes they change off in our life. And I'm running out of time here, but I want to share with you a couple of things that are so remarkable. It's all about love, and it's all about relationships. Everything. We will, when we finally leave, you will go through a life review. Somehow, everything that we ever thought or did or said is kind of recorded energetically somewhere on the other side, in our aura, wherever it is. And it's there for our reflection when we're finished this particular little dance that we're doing. And it is like they talk about when you read stories about near-death experiences and people that have the life review, and it's like a photograph album fanning in your mind, or a videotape going of every moment in your life. And I don't know how it's possible, because I experienced what seemed to be hours and hours of this in probably 2 minutes, because we have the total recall. When I had this experience of life review when I was dying, and I want to tell you just briefly about it, because there's a couple of significant things that changed everything in my perception. We can, when we're having this review and it's just fanning through, we can at any time stop it and examine a certain item or examine a certain event. And there were 2 events that I stopped. And one was just, and these are things that I had difficulty even remembering or thinking about. The first event that I stopped was an incident in the schoolyard when I was about 12 or 13 years old. It was at recess time, and I was standing with my back against the brick wall of the schoolhouse, trying to impress a couple of young ladies, one on either side of me. And there was this kid, and we all know a kid like this, just an annoying little devil. And I mean, probably he thought he was funny, and he was yappy all the time, and one of those that you just want to smack, right? And he never shut up, right? And so I'm standing against this brick wall, and he's about 5 feet away from me. He walks by, and he's got a basketball, and he says, "Elder, catch." And he threw the ball, and it smacked me right on the nose, banged my head against the brick wall, right? And there's tears coming, because you can't get your nose smacked, and there's tears coming out, and there's girls there, right? I had it with this kid. And I knocked him down immediately. And I jumped on him, and I wanted to just wail on him. And I experienced every single emotion that I had, every part of that event. I experienced everything that happened. My feelings, my humiliation, my anger. And then something changed. And I became this kid. And I experienced everything that he experienced. His humiliation, his terror, because he knew he was going to take a beating. And how stupid he felt for doing this. It didn't work out. And I really smoked him, so he was bleeding out of his nose and his pain and everything else. And he was just sort of in horror. And I experienced everything that this kid felt. And it just dawned on me in that moment, and I thought, I don't need Jesus Christ to judge me. I don't need God to judge me. This kid is judging me. I'm judging me. I can I've probably told this story 200 times to audiences, and every time I do, I still get choked at. It does make a difference. All right? Now, we are all going to experience something like that. We've all done dumb things, right? And we're all going to go through this. No question. Some harder than others. But it's a role that we chose to take on sometimes. When we experience that, we experience it, and I don't want you to be afraid of it because it's such a wonderful revelation. Because there is no end, right? There's not a time when you will not be, when you will not be conscious. From the perspective, when we have this experience, we are in the Spirit. And we look at it in a different way, because we have the larger understanding of where it comes from. It's when I'm back in my body that the emotion hits me. But in that moment, I'd be like, ooh, didn't know that, right? And we're all going to experience it. But I want you to not be afraid of that, because it's a wonderful thing, because on the other end of that are things that are so small and so innocuous, but they meant so much to others. The next time that I stop this event going on in my mind was an innocuous little event that occurred when I was the mayor of the city, small town, small city. There in our town was a gentleman who was rumored to be really an alcoholic, really abusive, smack his wife around, very abusive with the kids and stuff like that. And this isn't his name, but I'll call him Mr. Dirksen. And one morning I came running out of City Hall, came clambering down the stairs, and I literally banged into this guy. And I didn't, I was in a hurry to get to a meeting, and I was just sort of brushing him off, and it's sort of like, and I said, "Oh, Mr. Dirksen, how you doing? How's the wife? How are the kids? Geez, you're looking good. You got, blah, blah, blah." And it meant nothing to me, and I took off and headed down the road off to the meeting, and never thought about it again. I had no idea. That little innocuous act of kindness. And it's sort of like this, and I got to understand this, and I got to see the results of this, of that little thing that I hardly even remembered. And maybe it was like this, it was like on this day, Mr. Dirksen didn't go home because he felt better about himself. He didn't smack his wife around. The mayor talked to him, complimented him. And on this day, Mrs. Dirksen didn't take it out on the kids. And on this day, the kids didn't take it out on their friends in the schoolyard. And I got to see how this one little innocuous act of kindness affected so many people. So, my time is just about up. It is up and past. But if there's one thing I want to leave you with, and I wish I had time to talk about more sort of revelations, but I want to share with you this one thing that's important. When we die, and we will all go through this life review, when we finally leave, because we don't die, there's no such thing as death, when we leave these bodies behind, when we're cold and in the ground, it will not matter one little bit who won or who lost or how successful or how famous or how rich we became. The only thing that will ever matter to us, to you, is how we treated others on the way. So love each other.